It is my delight today to introduce our guest speakers. I first met them when they offered a trial run of their workshop on racial justice stances, in which participants chose how they wanted to be present in conversations about race, racism, and racial justice, and practiced how to maintain that stance, even in difficult conversations. Today, they'll be talking about accountability and anti-racism. In ethical culture, accountability is an important topic. We include a variety of beliefs among our members, and our unity is around action. Pearl Zhu wrote, "Accountability means to say what you do and do what you say." Bringing our values into alignment with our actions is crucial in trying to live more ethical lives, whether acting on our values of anti-racism or any issues of inclusion and respect for human dignity and worth. So our speakers today, Tamir Novotny is a coach and facilitator supporting leaders and organizations that are doing equity work in advancing justice. He has a master's in public administration and a BA from NYU. Kristell Caballero Saucedo is the program officer for racial equity initiatives at Borealis Philanthropy and also supports individuals in practicing anti-racism through her coaching practice. Among her achievements is her work as a Fulbright scholar in Mexico, where Kristell focused her research on Afro-Mexican rights. Kristell holds a BA in political science and Spanish from St. Olaf College and a change management certification from Cornell University. And so I turn over this program to the two of you.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great. Thank you, Joan, for the kind intro. And thank you all for, thank you Riverdale Junker Society for Ethical Culture for sharing your time with us and your community and for just showing up and being present today. As it was already shared, my name is Kristell Caballero Saucedo. I use she, her pronouns as my preferred pronouns, and I'm gonna let Tamir introduce himself real quick before we dive into today's talk.
Thanks, Kristell. My name is Tamir Novotny. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm joining you today from unceded Kahari territory in what is now known as Apex, North Carolina, and a longtime New Yorker with family roots going back there over 100 years.
Thank you, Tamir. And I am based in Lenape territory, also known as Brooklyn, New York. I've been in New York for now about 3 years, so excited to know that I'm near you all. So let's get started. Normally we don't give talks, but rather workshops. As Joan mentioned, we have the social justice stances workshop. So please bear with us as we try something new. We are here today to talk about accountability and racial justice. We're going to make the argument that it is impossible to build healthy communities or a just society using the stories we tell ourselves about accountability. Then we're going to offer some different ways of thinking about and practicing accountability that get us closer to build a stronger relationships with one another in a way that acknowledges our full humanity so that we're able to be in better community with each other and also be in community with each other in a more expansive way and build stronger coalitions for social justice. We all often have heard the word accountability being thrown around in various conversations, especially when it comes to race and racism. We've been taught that accountability matters, and yet we also understand it differently, right? Like we all have different definitions of accountability and think about it, what does accountability looks like in different ways. The question is, does the majority of people really know what accountability means? So today we will pose that under misuse and misinterpretation of the word accountability, behaviors around the word can cause harm and fail to solve problems and weaken our relationships to each other. We're here to talk or walk through how the narratives we've learned as a society around accountability don't really serve us, and to offer different ways of thinking about and practicing accountability that might serve us better. So I'm gonna pass it to Tamir to talk about the definition that we are operating under.
Thanks, Kristell. So as Kristell said, we're going to talk now about what accountability is or can be. And as many of you said when you reported back from your breakouts, our understanding of accountability in the US is largely individual, right? And that's rooted in the idea that the individual can make or break themselves with effort, which we know as people who are on our anti-racist journeys is a story that we tell in order to justify inequality and systemic racism. Moreover, in modern life, accountability is primarily around punishment, and it doesn't work. I always think about the Enron hearings, and I just remember, Congress people grandstanding and asking, pounding these executives with questions, and all they say is, "I do not recall. I do not recall." So we end up with rigid accountability on the individual level for the poor and the oppressed, but no real accountability for people who can buy their way out of it or can afford the lobbyists to put their own responsibility on the public. So we're calling for a different way of thinking about accountability that is rooted in liberatory values. And I'm going to share my screen to walk you through a definition. Give me one moment here. Can everybody see the slide? Great. So we will offer that accountability is an individual and collective practice. I'll read it through and then I'll walk through the individual pieces. It's an individual and collective practice of meeting each other's needs and holding each other to shared understandings in ways that keep us in relationship and affirm our shared humanity. So first, it's a practice, right? Accountability and how we implement it in our lives is a skill that can be honed through knowledge, reflection, and practice. It is individual and collective. So yes, we're responsible for our own actions, but also we're collectively responsible for holding spaces that allow us all to flourish and live free from harm with effective ways of repairing harm when it occurs. Accountability is fundamentally about meeting one another's needs. Those needs may be safety. How do I know you won't hurt me? How do I know you won't hurt me again? Or trust. How do I know that I can rely on you to do the things that we agree? We hold that together. We have to have shared understandings about how we want to be with one another so that when those are not met, we can address it. And fundamentally, accountability is about being able to be in relationship. By the time we get to a congressional hearing or a criminal case, our ability to relate to one another and address harm is so far gone that all we can do is punish. I would argue that's a failure of accountability, not an implementation of accountability. And fundamentally, accountability requires us to affirm our shared humanity. And for those who are suffering, who experience harm, means believing them, believing that they've experienced this thing, believing that we've played a role in that harm, perhaps even caused it directly. And for those who cause harm or make mistakes, believing that these are still human beings, right? Who sometimes are acting from their own trauma and other times are making mistakes. And while nobody who's causing harm is owed niceness or kindness as of right by people who've experienced it, collectively, we want to hold our own. As long as people are willing to do the work of being in community with us, they're not disposable. Slide. By the way, I will be able to, Kristell's going to have to jump, but I'll be around after this to answer any questions folks may have, because I know we're throwing a lot at you. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic back to Kristell to talk through how our notions of accountability are rooted in a confluence of forces that are steeped deeply in white supremacy.
Thank you. So actually, I believe Mary kind of started us off. So I'm going to continue with how white supremacy shows up in the way we understand accountability. Much of the time, we conflate accountability with punishment, as Tamir had mentioned before. So usually you hit your sister or your sibling, then you have to go to your room. You stole a loaf of bread, well, now you gotta go to jail. The notion of crime and punishment goes at least as far back as the code of Hammurabi, an eye for an eye. And the conflation of accountability with punishment is deeply rooted in American society and intrinsically linked to white supremacy. What we're about to share is our documented works like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. I don't know if some of you are familiar with it. Also the documentary The 13th, which I believe was on Netflix for a while, and many other places. So the first point is that prisons emerge in the US as an alternative to corporal punishment, for example, stocks and tearing and feathering. They were meant to be a place where people could reflect and repent for their actions, but they actually quickly became infamous for their inhumanity. Then policing as we know it didn't even exist until the mid-19th century, when it originated from two sources. So the first one was fugitive slave patrols, and the second one is corporations looking to offload the cost of their own private security to the government. And even then, in an attempt to suppress worker compensation. Throughout their history in American life, prisons and policing have been used as tools to terrorize and subjugate people of color, especially Black people. After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment was used to keep Black Americans in conditions equivalent to slavery through prison labor. So if you saw the documentary The 13th, you're familiar with this historical fact. Throughout the country during and after Reconstruction, police and sheriff departments around the United States were inhabited by Klansmen who supported or actively participated in lynching. And then around the time of the Civil Rights Movement, the Southern Strategy was born. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but in the Southern Strategy, white racists stopped talking about race and actually started talking about law and order as a dog whistle, basically. This strategy directly undergird Reagan's war on drugs and Bill Clinton's now infamous 1994 crime bill, which resulted in a huge enduring spike in imprisonment in the United States that disproportionately affected Black, Latin American, and Native American, and other people of color. In addition, a web of special interest actors has emerged around prisons. So previously I talked about corporations, and I'm talking about it again with private prisons being something that we are dependent on. So prison contractors and vendors, as well as politicians looking to appear tough on crime, and towns that depended on prison for jobs and economic activity. This interest lobby for tougher laws and tougher sentences for any behavior that can be criminalized. So as you notice, I just share historic context that has a lot to do more with racism than the word accountability. Indeed, these institutions we view as integral to maintaining safety and holding wrongdoers accountable, have in fact been used as a systems of social control. But as it stands, in stark contrast to what we've been socialized to believe about crime, punishment, and accountability. So our culture normalizes hero/villain narratives around police and criminals that either helps dehumanize people and or avoids a conversation about the root causes of social problems that actually are needed to be addressed. An example is the criminalization of poverty through comic book and Hollywood movies, where we often see villains either being from or having this low-income identity or also residing in low-income neighborhoods. Or often shows like Cops, which was famous, I think, in the early 2000s and I think 90s too. Cops had been leveraged actually as a marketing strategy when local police departments were under severe public scrutiny for abuse of power and police brutality, often showing a very myopic narrative of people's experiences, maybe people who were going to who experienced severe poverty, or people who had mental health issues or experienced addiction, often showing well, they were actually always consistent in showing Black low-income neighborhoods and as criminal zones, and really dehumanizing the people that were showing. All of this is to say that our narratives around accountability are deeply intertwined with crime and punishment, and innocence and guilt. But innocence and guilt are deeply complicated matters which have been artificially simplified by racially and financially motivated interests who are invested in criminalizing human beings for power and profit, and is deeply harmful for addressing actually human needs and social needs. So our notions of accountability have common roots with white supremacy, and so building awareness of this allows us to be intentional about our analysis by asking some questions that we already started this conversation with, which are: what kind of accountability practices make sense for you or for me, and for our community? And then the other question is, what does healing and repairing from caused harm look like if we're trying to be in relationship with each other and advance justice in our society? I'm going to pass it to Tamir to talk a bit more about what I just shared.
Thanks, Kristell. And what you said about the show Cops reminded me of something really gross about the show Law and Order. One of the acknowledged practices of that show was to have criminals of color, but almost never victims of color, because audiences were less sympathetic to victims of color. And you can see that in the way that news stories about people of different races involving crime and violent crime are covered in the media today. So I'm going to talk about what accountability practices look like, particularly in an anti-racist context, but I would offer that these things can be useful in any context. So the first thing is for us to understand, and primarily I'm going to assume that pretty much everyone on this call identifies as white, is to acknowledge that white supremacy and other systems of oppression operate through us, which is to say we can be racist and do racist things without being racist. And that's really, really important for us to hold. Each of us has been programmed against our will, right, with thoughts, internalized thoughts, value judgments, and narratives like the ones Kristell described around crime and punishment that have been used to privilege some and oppress others. And we have to deal with the harmful behaviors that are outputs of that programming, but the programming is the underlying issue. And whenever we're being called to account or calling someone else to account, our goal should always be to get at the programming as well as addressing the harm caused by the output. A corollary to this is that all of us are capable of causing harm, and all of us do. So when someone tells us that we've hurt them, our first instinct is to defend ourselves, but that usually results in our dismissing someone else's experience and causing more harm in the process. So if we can follow the guidance of a brilliant teacher named Prentice Hemphill and let go of our need for innocence, that there's always an innocent party and a guilty party, and instead focus on being two people trying to meet each other's needs, we can actually get to a place of healing and deepening trust in relationships rather than asserting and defending innocence and guilt. This is a core tenet of the model used by practitioners of transformative justice who reject the role of the state in addressing what we would consider criminal behavior in favor of an approach that affirms the humanity of all people, especially those who are subject to oppression. The next key piece we have to consider is how power and privilege. Oh, sorry, Kristell, this is your part, not mine. I'm so sorry. I will pass it back to you.
Thank you. So the next piece that we have to consider in our practice of accountability is how power and privilege play into it. In peer relationships, accountability works best when both people are on the same level playing field. But in multiracial group settings, playing fields are not level, even when there's other power structures that exist within this dynamic. The unevenness of this means that people of color typically risk more, do more later, and expend more time, more energy in engaging in equity work, while white people get to decide what is or is not appropriate or acceptable, rewarded or punished. And that is up for discussion, right? And moreover, people of color are typically conditioned to prioritize the comfort of white people because not doing so can leave them exposed to punishment or retaliation. Accounting for this requires a conscious effort from everyone's part. I'm gonna pass it to Tamir to tell us about the third piece.
Great, thanks. So now we're going to talk about internal experience. So the third piece we need to understand in our practice of accountability is how our own internal experiences affect how we show up when we're dealing with issues of accountability. So when we're deeply connected to ourselves, and when we do workshops, we do an exercise that Joan, I believe, has done with us, where you really connect to a time when you felt truly yourself, everything felt just right. When we're in that space, we have access to a vast range of inner resources. We are connected to our inherent deep wisdom, courage, compassion, dynamism. We have so many tools to connect with others and meet each other's needs. Our access to those inner resources becomes weakened when we get triggered. And when I say triggered, it's any event that takes us away from full presence and consciousness and into some sort of internal struggle that pulls us away from the interaction at hand, right? So that can be being called out for something we said, hearing something that triggers us, somebody saying something racist or sexist or heteronormative, even something that reminds you of like a past relationship. It can be anything. And that can put us into what we call stance traps. So for example, if you grew up in a household where everything was a fight and a colleague politely confronts you about something you said, you might respond as though you're in a fight. And that may feel perfectly normal to you, but to the person who reached out to you, it can actually be deeply hurtful or jarring, and then make that person less likely to bring that behavior to your attention in the future. So understanding what triggers us and what happens when we become triggered, and then learning to notice and respond consciously to that can help us navigate these situations better. It's also worth noting that our brains are wired to treat criticism like a survival threat. So the simple state of being called to account can trigger us just by itself. Kristell?
Yeah, so I just quickly, 30 seconds, want to sum it all up for you. You can hear me, right? It's not your head. Okay, cool. So the first point is focus on relationships, let go of the sense of innocence, consciously adjust power for power and privilege, and learn to notice and address internal experiences. So we're actually gonna take a pause here to do a Q&A. So if you have any questions, I think you can send them to Joan, and then Joan will say them out loud and we'll try to answer.